Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome. We are so glad to have you with us tonight. My name is Charlene Margot. I am co-founder of nonprofit The Parent Venture that brings you this program, the Parent Education Series, now in its 19th season. We are delighted to have with us tonight Dr. Jamil Zaki, who's going to be talking to you about his new book, Hope for Cynics. And really, we've called this talk Finding Hope in a Cynical World, which is, we kind of stole it from Jamil's Stanford talk. But this is a topic that's really important for all of us. We can tell by the response to this talk that it's important for you too. So we're just really, really glad to have Dr. Zaki with us tonight. Please join me, everyone, in a really warm welcome for Dr. Jamil Zaki. Thank you, Jamil.
Thanks very much, Charlene, for that kind introduction. Thanks to both you and Bev for the invitation to be here. And thanks to Cynthia for interpreting. I love that you all have that as part of these sessions. I'm going to try to share my screen. Hopefully nothing explodes. I assume that you can see my slides, but not my notes, if that is...
Perfect.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, so again, thanks everybody for being here. I'm excited to share my work on hope and cynicism with you today. As mentioned, this is not going to be an hour-long talk or even close to it. So I hope that you all can have questions and thoughts. And please, I want you to feel utterly welcome to share anything that's on your mind. I want to begin today with a pop quiz. I am a professor. That is what I do. I'm going to ask you to use the chat for this one. So, so please get ready. So this is a pop quiz about recent history and the pandemic in particular. I'd like to gather your intuitions about what the pandemic did to human kindness. And you will have three options. Compared to the years before, 2017 to 2019, what do you think happened to kindness around the world during the early pandemic of 2020 to 2022? Do you think that kindness around the world increased, decreased, or stayed about the same? So again, please use the chat and let me know what you think happened to kindness around the world during the early pandemic. Okay, this is one of the most optimistic, hopeful crowds I've ever seen. A strong majority saying increase, but definitely some people saying decreased, and a few saying stay the same as well. Thank you very much for sharing those thoughts. And try to remember what your guess was, because we'll return to that in a moment. I think that your guess about how people behave during the pandemic is a sort of momentary test of a more eternal question. There's a stereotype that disasters reveal who we really are. When our routines are in place and everything is going fine, well, then it's easy to be polite. But when things fall apart, when the lights turn out, when chaos ensues, well, maybe that's when our true colors shine through. But what are those colors? Are human beings generally kind or cruel, compassionate or callous, good or bad? I don't try to answer those questions as a scientist, but I'm fascinated by how people answer them, because it turns out that your intuitions, your beliefs about human nature, shape the lives that you live and the communities that you build. I'm also interested in our answers to these questions because they've been changing. In 1972, about half of Americans believed that most people can be trusted. By 2018, that had fallen to a third of Americans. That's a drop about as big as the stock market took during the financial collapse of 2008. At the same time as our faith in each other collapsed, so too did our faith in institutions. Here you see trust in everything, from government to medicine to science to education to industry, all collapsing at the same time. We are living in this country through a 5-decade-long trust deficit. And when trust collapses, something else rises in its place. That is cynicism, the belief that people in general are selfish, greedy, and dishonest. Now, cynicism is a totally understandable response to a world that sometimes feels full of things like corruption, injustice, and inequality. But that doesn't mean that cynicism helps us. In fact, it hurts us at basically every level scientists can measure. Compared to non-cynics, cynics live with more chronic stress, they tend to have worse relationships, they die younger than non-cynics, And cynical communities also fare worse. They tend to be more divided and extreme, less civically engaged, and they tend to stagnate, both socially and economically. Like so many difficulties, the brunt of cynicism is actually borne by younger people. And I think that part of this, not to shine too dark a light on us as parents, is because oftentimes we, not anyone on this call in particular, but we as a community sometimes pass cynicism on. Researchers recently asked hundreds of parents what they thought their children should believe in order to succeed in life. And they found that the majority of parents thought that their kids should believe that the world is fundamentally competitive. Even more parents thought that their kids should distrust other people. And this was even true of parents who themselves were pretty trusting. Here's one mother in this study. When asked about her own beliefs, she said, I think most people have good in them, so it's worth being trusting. When asked what she wanted her kids to believe, she said, it's a pity, but we must rather teach them the opposite, not to trust people. As a parent, I resonate a lot with this. I do believe that in general people are pretty good, but I also feel like my primary job as a dad is to keep my daughters safe. And so sometimes I find myself wanting to protect them so badly that I focus them on the scary parts of life and the scary parts of other people. I think that's a really common instinct. We want our kids to be better off than we are, to be safer than we are, so we convince them that the world is a dangerous place. But I don't know if that's really helping them. That same research that found that parents think that their kids should see the world as competitive and dangerous in order to succeed, that same study found that adults who see the world as competitive instead of cooperative, as dangerous instead of safe, do not succeed as much. They were less happy, more depressed, and less likely to do well professionally. And it seems as though the message that our generation might be passing on to younger ones is working, right? So in 2019, a national survey asked Americans of different generations whether they agreed that most people would take advantage of you if they got the chance. And what it found is that Generation Z is the least trusting on record since we've been collecting data like this. And that's not the only thing that they're experiencing less of. Last year's World Happiness Report might have been called the American Unhappiness Report because the US, for the first time, fell out of the world's top 20 happiest countries, driven entirely by a huge drop in happiness among Americans under 30. Now, there are lots of reasons for this, but I think one might be the fact that we are, again, passing on cynicism to younger generations. And I'll say more about that and really curious to hear your thoughts as well. So, if cynicism was a pill, its warning label would be like 3 feet long, like one of those CVS receipts that is super long for no discernible reason, right? The warnings would include depression, cellular inflammation, heart disease, loneliness, lower salary. We didn't even talk about that one. In other words, if cynicism was a pill, it would be a poison, which begs the question, why are more of us swallowing it each year? Why is something so harmful also catching on? I think one big reason is that our culture has glamorized gloom. Since writing Hope for Cynics, I've received hundreds of emails from self proclaimed cynics who tell me something along the lines of, yeah, I'm cynical, and it doesn't always feel good to think the worst about people, but I can't help it. I'm just too smart to be any other way. I've been around the block too many times. And I think there is this stereotype that cynicism is a form of wisdom, hard earned. This is not new. More than 100 years ago, George Bernard Shaw wrote, the power of accurate observation is commonly called cynicism by those who have not got it, which is pretty funny, I have to give it to him. And people seem to agree. In one set of studies, researchers presented people with a story of one person who was super cynical and didn't trust anybody, and another person who was more trusting and open minded. And they asked these people, which of these two individuals do you think would do better on a series of tasks? 70% of people believe that cynics would do better than non-cynics on cognitive tasks, that they're smarter. 85% of people believe that they would be socially smarter. For instance, better able to tell who's lying and who's telling the truth. In other words, most of us put a lot of faith in people who don't have much faith in people, which, don't try to say that three times fast, but it's true. And most of us are wrong. Psychologists call this the cynical genius illusion, because it turns out that even though we act as though cynics are smarter than non-cynics, in fact, cynics perform less well on cognitive tests than non-cynics, and they're worse at figuring out who's lying and who's telling the truth as well. Now, why would that be? Well, if you're cynical, you might not have much faith in people, but you might have a lot of faith in your assumptions about them. You start with a conclusion. Humanity is pretty awful, and then you just look for evidence that supports that conclusion. In other words, you think like a lawyer in the prosecution against humanity. No offense to lawyers out there, but starting with the conclusion and then trying to defend it is a great way to advocate. It's a great way to confirm your suspicions, but it's a terrible way to learn about the world. And cynics, it turns out, don't learn in very quick or agile ways about other people. So, one of my missions these days is to try to dethrone cynicism, to take it off the pedestal that we've put it on as a culture. I want us to see it for what it is, not a form of wisdom, but a bug in the way that we think. The name of this bug is negativity bias, the idea that in general, people pay way more attention to harmful and threatening information than to the good stuff. And maybe that's for a reason. You can imagine 300,000 years ago, somebody who was freaked out by a predator on the horizon might have survived longer than their friend who was blissed out by the sunset on the opposite horizon. But the problem comes when you take this ancient bias and combine it with a hyper-modern media ecosystem that exists not to make us connected or informed or happy, but to keep us scrolling and clicking and watching, often by inundating us with as much negative information as possible. It turns out that when you put those pieces together, you get a pretty warped view of what people are really like. In my lab, we've documented this. We often present people with stories about an individual who acts in both moral and immoral ways, being generous and selfish, kind and then unkind. And we find that when given this information on both sides, people judge this person very negatively, as though the worst things that we do are the best evidence about who we are. We find that people gossip 3 times more about a person's selfish behavior than their positive behaviors or generous behaviors. And we find that people remember people's negative actions more than their positive ones. I have to say, I am totally guilty of this myself. If I have 10 interactions in a given day, 9 of them are pleasant and one person is sort of a jerk, guess who I'll be talking about at the end of the day? In fact, my daughter recently caught me doing just that. I was driving her and her sister to school in San Francisco, and somebody cut us off in traffic. And my kids quickly learned all about this person and their moral character and their family history, a lot of bad things. And my daughter said, Dad, why are you not talking about the 1,000 people who didn't cut you off today? Which, I mean, she really had me there. She really had me there. She got me. Doubly embarrassing because at that time I was in the middle of writing a book about fighting cynicism. So goes to show you, just studying something isn't the same as having all the answers in your own life. At any rate, at any rate, negativity bias is so pervasive that I think we're often backwards in thinking about what the world is like. People tell me all the time that hope is like wearing a pair of rose-colored glasses, ignoring real problems. But in fact, I would say, because of negativity bias, most of us are wearing soot-colored glasses right now. Decades of evidence shows that people vastly underestimate how trustworthy, generous, open-minded, and warm others really are. Now, here's what I'm not saying. I'm not saying everybody's wonderful and nobody does bad things. Of course, people do. What I am saying is that the average person underestimates the average person. And that includes the pop quiz that we began with. I asked you all what you thought the pandemic did to human kindness. You all were way more positive than most audiences that I speak to, which frankly undermines my point a little, a little bit, but that's okay. That's okay. I have a backup. I recently asked 1,000 people a very similar question. I made it a little bit more specific. I asked what people thought happened to charitable donations, volunteering, and helping strangers during the early pandemic. And I found that more than half the people in my survey thought that these behaviors had gone down, whereas barely 20% thought that they had increased. And I get it. I mean, I remember 2020. You would turn on the TV and what would you see? People fighting in grocery stores over toilet paper. I mean, it seemed like people had all gone very antisocial. But when we can, we should try to follow not the media, but the data. And it turns out here there are terrific data. What you can see is that all three of these behaviors, of these kind behaviors, actually increased during the pandemic. In some cases, by gigantic amounts. I mean, a 12% increase in helping strangers is just tectonic. And these increases were not a flash in the pan. They lasted for years. In fact, a newer survey found that these levels of kindness remain higher around the world than they were before the pandemic. I do think that disasters reveal who we really are. But in this case, what we found is really beautiful. At the hardest time in many people's lives, during the largest disaster of the 21st century, people reacted not by falling apart, but by coming together. Not by focusing on themselves, but on trying to figure out what they could do for other people. Again, our true colors in this case were pretty dazzling. So there was this avalanche of human kindness. That's the good news. The bad news is a lot of people didn't notice it. Not you all. You clearly noticed it, and kudos to you for that. But a question then becomes, how do we get better at noticing human goodness? I want to propose some ideas for anti-cynicism. That is, actively pushing back against the biases and structures that create cynical thinking. And I want to start with a mindset. A lot of us assume that the only alternative to cynicism, believing that everyone's terrible, is being gullible, believing that everybody's great, trusting everybody until you inevitably get taken advantage of. But there is a third way. That is skepticism. If cynics think like lawyers in the prosecution against humanity, and gullible people are on the defense, skeptics sit out the trial. They think not like lawyers, but like scientists, waiting for evidence to decide who they can trust and in what situations they can open up. And because of this, skeptics tend to be more cognitively agile. They learn more and adapt more quickly. I want to suggest that we add something to our skepticism, which is a dash of hope. This is combining a scientific mindset with an understanding of our own biases, knowing that because we tend to focus on the negative, when we think like scientists, reality will often exceed our expectations. Pleasant surprises will be everywhere. If hopeful skepticism is a mindset, what do we do with it? Well, I want to argue that in addition to thinking like scientists, we can act like scientists by collecting better social data. This often means giving people a chance to show us who they are, by trusting them, by being open and vulnerable, which can be scary. But I'm not telling you that you have to be reckless. I'm not telling you to share your bank information with a prince who's going to wire you $14 million dollars or anything like that, but rather that we can take calculated risks on other people. This is a great way to find out who they are. As Ernest Hemingway once said, the best way to find out if you can trust somebody is to trust them. I want to show you evidence about how that might work in two different situations from the research done in my own lab. The first setting that I want to talk about is with younger people on college campuses. I shared with you earlier that young adults in the US are experiencing much lower happiness than they were before. They're also experiencing much more of what we might not want them to go through. Here you see data from 200,000 first year college students, and you see these incredible, terrible rises in things like depression, anxiety, and self injury. This, of course, is terrifying to many people, and there's lots of reasons that young adults are lonely and struggling. But we thought that maybe one reason that students could be lonely on campus is because they might have a soft form of cynicism about their peers. They might underestimate the people around them. So recently, we surveyed thousands of Stanford undergraduates, and we asked them questions about themselves and the average Stanford student. For instance, how likely are you or the average student to empathize with someone who feels bad or to enjoy meeting other students? We discovered not one, but two Stanfords. The first one, here in orange, was made up of real students who were incredibly warm and friendly and compassionate. These people wanted to care for each other, wanted to connect with each other. The second Stanford, here in blue, lived inside students' minds, and it was a colder, pricklier place. Students deeply underestimated how warm and friendly their average peer was. And this cynicism didn't stay in their minds. We found that students who thought least of their peers asked the least of them as well. They were less likely to strike up conversations with strangers, to confide in their dorm mates when they were struggling. And because of this, they ended up less connected, lonelier, and less mentally healthy over time. And we thought, this is a tragedy. I mean, if social connection is like a psychological form of nourishment, these students were starving in the middle of an organic grocery store. They were surrounded by people who wanted to connect, but they didn't know that, so they didn't try. And we thought, maybe we can do something about this. Maybe we can help them collect better social data. So we started an ad campaign in 2023 where the target audience was Stanford undergraduates and the product was also Stanford undergraduates. We shared in certain dorms posters like this one with real information about, for instance, saying that 95% of Stanford students help others who are feeling down, 85% enjoy meeting and becoming friends with students they don't already know. And we found that students who learned this information were less likely to underestimate their peers, fighting that cynicism, were more likely to take a chance on other students, for instance, striking up conversations, and 6 months later had more friends. Now, what I love about this project and about anti cynicism work in general is that in order to fight cynicism, we didn't have to lie to anybody. We just had to show them the truth. And this isn't only the case at Stanford. I've worked with middle schools, with executives, with hospital systems, and everywhere I go, people want connection, but they don't realize that's what everybody else wants too. So showing people to each other can be a powerful way to fight cynicism and build that connection. And you can do this in your communities. You can do this in your families. One thing that we've started doing ever since my daughter caught me being mean to strangers on the road is something called positive gossip. That is, each day at dinner, we try to share a story of human goodness that we found throughout the day. The philosophy here, I guess, builds on Mr. Rogers, the great Fred Rogers. I mean, I hate to elaborate on anything that he said because it's so perfect, but he famously said that in tough times, we should look for the helpers. But another thing that we can do is talk about them. And when we do, we help people realize how much good there is all around them in their communities and maybe open up a little bit more. I want to talk about one more context in which we think trying to take a leap of faith on others might be powerful. It's a really tough one, and it's one where I know there's not a lot of hope these days. That is American political division. Americans, it's no secret, are very sorted. We spend far less time with people we disagree with. We like those people a lot less than we did in years and decades past. And because we avoid the people we disagree with more than ever, we know less about them. Well, media companies are, of course, happy to fill that gap, often with the absolute most frightening information that they can about the other side. And because of that, Americans are systematically wrong about folks they disagree with. In my lab and many others, we've asked both Republicans and Democrats, what do you think the average person you disagree with is like? And we find that people on both sides believe that the other side is far more extreme than they really are, twice as hateful as they really are, and four times more violent than they really are. And if you believe this about the other side, why on earth would you ever want to talk with them? I understand that impulse. Trust me, I do. I'm about to suggest that those conversations across difference might be powerful and productive, but I want to be clear about what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that we owe people our time or attention if they're saying something hateful to us, if they would be violent towards us, if they would deny us our basic rights. I'm not saying that there aren't really extreme and dangerous people out there or that we have to engage with them. What I am saying is that when we take a chance to be curious about people who we disagree with, the results are often surprising. I know this because my lab recently brought people together for such conversations. We brought about 150 Americans, Republicans and Democrats, together for Zoom conversations about abortion, gun control, and climate change. Really easy stuff, right? And before these folks had these conversations, we asked them, how do you think it will go on a scale of one really terribly to 100 fantastically well? And generally, people predicted that these conversations would be somewhere between neutral and awful. They thought they would dislike the person they were talking with. They also thought that they would dislike the other side more after the conversation. You know who else was scared about these conversations? We were, the experimenters. We were sure that people would act really badly. We trained a group of moderators Talmudically in what they should do, not if, but when people started to dox each other or threaten each other or swear at each other. We predicted that about 25% of these conversations would have to be stopped due to incivility. I'm sure maybe you can guess what percentage actually had to be stopped. It was zero. And after these conversations, we asked these folks, how did that feel? And the most common response that we got was a 100 on a 100-point scale. People found these conversations extraordinarily positive, shockingly so, in part because they realized they were wrong about the person on the other end. Here you see what people predicted that other person would be like in blue and how they found the person to actually be in orange. And you can see that compared to their expectations, they found folks they disagreed with to be far more open-minded, logical, and empathic, and far less angry. After these conversations, people didn't just feel good about the one person they talked with, they felt more open-minded about the entire other side, an effect that lasted for 3 months. These conversations are not just nice, they're powerful. Research finds that one of the best ways to persuade people of a perspective politically is not to try to pelt them with facts or browbeat them, but rather to have open, empathic conversations. It turns out that if you want somebody to listen to you, one of the best things that you can do is listen to them first. If you treat somebody like they are worth investing in, like they are worth trusting, then they're more likely to step up. Which brings me to a broad point about anti-cynicism work and really psychology in general, which is that our beliefs are not just beliefs, they are self-fulfilling prophecies. What we think about other people affects how we treat them, and how we treat them affects how they react. Human beings are a reciprocal species. You get what you give. When you act as though you can't count on your peers, they won't give you much to count on. When you act as though people you disagree with are monsters, you'll bring out their most monstrous side. But the positive side of this is what's known as earned trust. When people realize that we believe in them, they're more likely to step up and meet our expectations. So again, taking that leap of faith on another person, whether they're an acquaintance or a supposed enemy, can be shocking in how positive that turns out. Now, there's no guarantees in life. I'm not telling you that if you take a leap of faith, you'll definitely have a great experience. But if you're like most people, statistically, you'll be surprised at how well it goes. I want to end with a couple of thoughts. One is on how we might apply this as parents. And here I want to draw on the protagonist of my book, one of my friends, and actually one of my heroes, the late psychologist and neuroscientist Emile Bruno. There's lots and lots that I could say about Emile, but I don't have time. Suffice it to say, he was one of the most hopeful and inspirational people I've ever known. And when I asked him where he got his hope, he talked a lot about his parents and his father in particular, and a style of parenting that his father used, which Emile called underbearing attentiveness. I just love that term. The way that he described it is that Emile's dad was there for him, but fully trusted him to make his own decisions. And I think that that's, again, a style that I aspire to. I don't think that I achieve it all the time, but I think that if we want our kids to be more open to the world, not naively trusting, but hopeful skeptics, then one thing that we can do is show them that we believe in them, that we want them to be empowered to meet the world and navigate it as they see fit. Obviously, with us in the background, but with us still there, being attentive, but not being overbearing. All right, the last note that I want to talk about is the connection between our faith in people now and our hope for the future. I understand that this might seem like an ironic time to talk about hope. There is so much going on in the world that makes hope feel difficult, privileged, even toxic. But I want to be clear about what hope is not. Optimism is the idea that things will go well. It can make people feel happy, but it can also make us complacent. I mean, if a bright future is on the way, you can kind of sit on the couch and just wait for it to arrive. Hope is different. It's the idea that things could go well, but that we don't know what the future holds. And in that uncertainty, there's room for our actions to matter. Hope, as psychologists see it, has three pieces: a positive goal, something that could get better in the future; willpower, or a desire to achieve that goal; and way power, a path through which we can get from where we are to where we want to be. Seen this way, hope is not designed or optimized for the best times. Hope, as psychologists see it, is a response to difficulty, to turmoil, to adversity. It's a way of facing it in an agentic and empowered way. And hope tends to be part of trying to make change. We often believe that maybe cynicism is a radical feeling because cynics see all that's wrong in society. And that's half right. Cynics see problems, but they don't see solutions. If you think that the worst parts of our culture reflect who we really are inside, well, then what hope is there for any change? Why try to change anything? And indeed, cynics compared to non-cynics vote less often. They take part in social movements less often. They're even more supportive of authoritarian leaders than non-cynics. So I would argue that hope is not a radical emotion at all. In fact, I think it's a tool of the status quo. By contrast, if you look at social movements throughout history and around the world, you see two things in common. One, a fierce rejection of the status quo, but two, a deep faith, not necessarily in politicians or elites, but in our fellow citizens, in our fellow people, that the understanding that most of us want something better. Hope allows us to fight for a better future by letting us see it more clearly. I'll stop there and really look forward to the conversation and to your questions.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Zaki. That was an amazing discussion. So we have lots of really great questions coming in from the audience, but just because I get to start by asking one of my own. And that is, what brought you to write this book at this time? It's like you had the crystal ball or the magic 8 ball or something, Jamil. How did you know?
Well, Charlene, I wrote this book because I needed it. I think that there's this assumption that what people study, they must be really good at in their own lives. I've been studying human goodness for 2 decades now. And so people sometimes assume that I must just walk around blissed out by how great everybody is. And, maybe I would have written this book because I wanted to teach people to be as uh, anti-cynical as I already was. That couldn't be further from the truth, right? I mean, I wrote this book shortly after, or I began work on this book shortly after Emil died, during the middle of the depths of the early pandemic, at a time that I was really losing a lot of faith in humanity. And I kind of thought to myself, if I'm struggling so much with this, how are other people feeling? And the deeper that I dove into the science of cynicism, the more I realized how harmful it is, but also how wrong it often is. And I realized, wow, that helped me, first of all, to learn. I'm not saying that I'm a perfect anti-cynic by any means, but it helped me a lot. I adopted some new practices in my parenting and in my life. And I thought, gosh, I really needed this. I bet that a lot of other people maybe need this too.
That really helps explain it. You call yourself a private cynic. So my our next question is cynicism like happiness? Is it born or learned? Is there a cynicism set point?
That's a great question. I would say that, so there is a genetic component to cynicism, a heritable component, as we would say in the literature, but it's really small. Estimates suggest from studies suggest that about 30 or 20% of a person's cynicism is based on their genes. That leaves the vast majority to be learned, as you're saying, right? So I don't think cynics are born. I think in general they're made. And right, we might have different set points, but people change a lot, or can change a lot over the course of their lives. If you are in a really competitive environment, or if there's a lot of corruption around you, for instance, you're much more likely to become cynical than if you're in an environment where people tend to work together.
Okay, that's really interesting. That brings us to this next question. I think this is a good one. Writer asks, I would love your thoughts on situational cynicism. We become like that only in certain environments.
I think this person is right. I think that absolutely we become more cynical in certain environments, and I would add to that that it's not unreasonable to be very skeptical, at least in certain environments, right? I mean, if you transfer to a new school and everybody there is a bully and they're treating you poorly, kind of why would you trust a new person who you meet in that environment, right? I think
Yeah.
that there's an adaptiveness that we all have in our minds where we try to morph ourselves to shift our minds to match what the situation provides. That said, I think we do that in what I would call an asymmetric way. We update more based on our bad experiences than on our good experiences. So, if you were to go to a new school and three people treated you well and one person was sort of mean to you, you might put up your guard more than is necessary, more than is rational, and more than is healthy for you because of negativity bias.
You know, we used to talk about when I was at Bing, we mentioned to you, Bev and our early childhood educators, we would say to parents, it's like if your child has a handful of pebbles, they're more liable to spend one. But if they only have one pebble in their hand, they're not going to spend it. It's kind of like that, isn't it?
It is, yeah, absolutely. And maybe we feel as though we have fewer pebbles than we really do.
Yeah. And maybe today we feel like we don't have very many at all.
That's right. That's right.
Well, all right. So, Jamila, you talk about hopeful skepticism as an antidote to cynicism. What can parents do to encourage or model more of that in their kids?
Yeah, this is a great question. I mean, so a few things. I mean, one, I think it's really important to fact check our cynical feelings, not to invalidate them, but to almost engage in, I don't know if Charlene, if you all have talked about cognitive behavioral therapy with this group, but CBT is this extraordinarily powerful way of treating depression and anxiety and phobias, for instance, by challenging people's beliefs. A person suffering from depression, they'll go on a bad date and they'll say, "That's it, I'm unlovable. No one will ever care for me." Right? And in therapy, their therapist will collaborate with them to challenge that belief. Wait a minute, that's a big claim. What makes you so confident in that? Are you sure? What evidence could change your mind? Likewise, I think it's really helpful with kids, but also, frankly, with ourselves to fact check our cynicism. I know sometimes I read the news and I leave thinking, wow, everybody is just awful. I'm on Twitter and I think, wow, humanity really stinks, you know? And more these days, I try to ask myself, well, wait a minute, Jamil, that's a big claim. If you had to defend that hypothesis, how would you do it? And I think that sort of what we would call reality testing can be helpful for us as individuals and as parents. And then I really think positive gossip is a powerful tool as well. I know I just talked about it, but I can't emphasize enough that it's just a simple thing that we can do with our families that can change the narrative. It also, by the way, sort of changes not just what we talk about, but the way that we think. If you know that at dinner you have to tell a story about human goodness, you will be looking for it during the day, and you will notice that it's not that hard at all to find.
You know, it's funny, Jamil. I tell people this story. The worst year of my life, my father died, my husband left, and I lost my house. What I found, incredibly, was that I was really positive.
Mm,
Through this incredible negative journey, my own true self kind of service, I was more positive than I thought I was. So
wow.
it taught me a really powerful lesson that we can change that, right? I mean, my daughter has a really high happiness set point. She keeps us honest, but I love that positive gossip piece of advice.
And Charlene, thank you for sharing that, first of all. And that's actually, although you went through so much adversity, it's a beautiful story. And I don't know about you, but I think a lot of people, well, I do know, you just told me, but I think for a lot of people, our hardest moments, as painful as they are also opportunities to tap into a deep
Yeah.
well of meaning and strength. I know for me, losing friends, going through chronic illness, just the most difficult times in my life have also been the ones where people have shown up for me the most, and I've felt that sort of warmth of human goodness, and B, I've found the strength in myself to focus on the positive.
Well, you know, you talk about your friend Emil as your North Star. And so he's not here, but he's still guiding you, isn't he?
Oh, that's a beautiful thought. Thank you for sharing that. Absolutely. And my hope is that he can guide many more people. It was such a humbling experience to try to tell even a tiny bit of his story, and that's not a choice that I made on my own. That was a choice made collaboratively with his wife, Stephanie, who sort of graciously sort of opened his network to me. I got to talk with his elementary school teachers and his college rugby teammates and his sister. I mean, it was really just this beautiful experience. He was my friend, but I actually feel like I got to know him more after his death than before.
I just love that. In the book, just audience, Jamil talks about the collaboration. Even though Emil is gone, you're still collaborating.
And it's one of the greatest collaborations of my life and one of the greatest honors as well.
I think that's beautiful. Okay, let's try another trickier question. Good one. Regarding cynicism, is there a dose response? The more cynical you are, the worse the outcomes. Is there a blurring of the line between cynicism and depression?
Great questions all around. Yes, there's a dose response. A lot of the research in this space is correlational, right? So the higher your level of cynicism, the worse your outcomes on a variety of different metrics. That, by the way, is not to say that cynicism causes those worst outcomes. If you're running a correlational study, you don't necessarily know, right? So if you're cynical, then 10 years later, for instance, you're more likely to have heart disease. That's not the same as saying that cynicism causes heart disease, but there's a compelling relationship between the two above and beyond other risk factors. So that was one part of the question. The other part was around cynicism and depression. So the answer to that is complicated. Cynicism and depression are related to each other, but it's not a one-to-one by any means. It's what we'd call a moderately sized correlation. So people who are cynical tend to be more depressed, but it's not the same thing. I often think of cynicism kind of like social depression, if that makes any sense, right?
Yeah.
Depression is a set of beliefs about ourselves and the world that are sometimes irrationally negative and that make us feel awful about ourselves and the world. Cynicism is a set of beliefs about other people and humanity that are somewhat irrational and that make us feel really horribly about other people and also change the way that we behave around them. So I think that there are really interesting parallels between depression and cynicism, but they're not the same.
Okay, that's really interesting. So, Jamil, I know this may be a little bit personal, but we are talking to a safe audience of parents primarily. Early in the book, you say, parenting straightened my moral compass. Can you tell us what you mean by that?
Well, that is a personal question, but I did write about it, so it's totally fair game. So I think that for various reasons, for a lot of my life, including some of my adult life, I was a pretty insecure person. I would say that I was not like securely attached to my own parents, for instance. And insecurity manifests itself in many different ways. And for me, one of the ways that that happened was in being really kind of ambitious and trying to rack up a bunch of achievements. Not unusual, by the way, at Ivy League schools and other places like that. I mean, I think we're in the middle of a very strong achievement culture right now that's maybe not so healthy. And I was definitely a part of that. I would put the weight of my self-worth a lot of times on what I had accomplished as an individual. And for me, having children just exploded that very quickly, right? I mean, it seemed so ridiculous to worry about publishing a paper or getting an award after the girls were born. And I mean that in a great way. I mean, it was great to notice how ridiculous those things are. I mean, I'm not saying that they're not good, but as a source of self-worth, they're just so small compared to family. And so I think that's what I meant through with that quote.
Well, I just thought it was beautiful, Jamil. So I just had to pick that out because I thought it was really lovely. You mentioned your own bicultural background also in Hope for Cynics. So this is a great question. Um, how do cultural and society factors influence our levels of cynicism, and how can families counteract these influences at home?
Yeah, this is a great question. So there's a lot of assumptions about this. A lot of people believe that more individualistic cultures would be more cynical than more collectivistic cultures. That is not true. In fact, the number one sort of correlate, right, across cultures, the number one difference between cultures that tracks differences in cynicism is inequality. So countries that are more economically unequal tend to be more cynical. And so that's true in South America, that's true in Asia, that's true in Europe, right? Within continent, within sort of individualistic collectivism, that doesn't matter as much as how unequal societies are. And also times that years that a particular country is more unequal, its people also trust each other less. Years that a country is more equal, people tend to trust each other more.
So do you think that inequality is contributing to what we're seeing in the US right now?
I mean, history is not, I mean, these are all correlations, so I can't say for sure, but I strongly suspect that's the case.
Yeah, I would think so. Such an interesting question. All right, let's turn to this. You talked tonight about earned trust. The writer asks here, how do you suggest reestablishing earned trust?
I assume that this person might mean after a breach of trust, perhaps.
I would guess so.
Yeah, I think that this is a really delicate subject, right? So, I think that when people have betrayed us, especially if that betrayal has been very hurtful or even traumatic, not trusting that person in the future is not the same as being cynical. I think that's more like skepticism. So I'm not saying that if somebody breaks your heart, you should immediately open your heart to them again, right? As though nothing has happened. I think that skepticism about that person is completely reasonable. I would say that rebuilding trust is a matter of iterating, right? Of slowly increasing back again. I don't think that you should trust somebody to the same level as you had before, but rather, first of all, wait for a signal that they are ready to change, that they're different in some way, that they acknowledge you, and that they're there for you again, and then take small risks with them, and then increase the size of those risks, sort of incrementally to try to build back the relationship.
Okay, thank you. Really good advice. Parents, I hope you're listening. So this is one that Bev and I have been thinking about. Um, how can parents address their own cynicism and cultivate more hopeful perspectives in their daily lives. You talked about the example of not swearing about drivers who get in your way. I keep saying to my husband, you're going to get more of that because you notice it so much. But
Yeah.
for those of us, not me, but many people tend towards cynicism. What can families do? What can parents do to combat that in themselves?
Okay, I've got a few thoughts here. Let me share two in particular. One is I think that we can all try to be more intentional about our media diets, right? It's so easy to just doom scroll our way into, psychological collapse. And, these sites, Twitter, Facebook, whatever, I mean, they're giving us information, but the information is very skewed. Same with, by the way, the New York Times and MSNBC and Fox, whatever you watch, these news sources know that people pay more attention to negativity, and so they flood us with negativity. So I'm not saying that the information that they provide is necessarily wrong, but it's one side of the story. And so what I try to do is to balance that. There's a website I would encourage anybody to check out, which is the Solutions Journalism Network. This
That's
is
what
a
I was going to ask you next. Say that
yeah.
again, Neil.
The Solutions Journalism Network. This is a terrific organization that sources thousands and thousands of news stories from across the world that are positive. And I don't mean positive like a turtle rescued a cat, which I'm sure that's positive as well, but positive more like, hey, here are some real gigantic problems: inequality, gerrymandering, climate change. But here are people, usually everyday people, trying to make a difference. So understanding not just problems, but solutions that people are pursuing can help us not be just naively hopeful or optimistic, but at least have some idea that there's a reason to have some hope. So that's thing one that I would say about combating our own cynicism as families. And then another thing that I might suggest in terms of trying to beat back or reduce our own cynicism in the house is to focus on where we have agency. I talked about how hope includes this idea of way power, not just, oh, here's something that I would like, but here's something that I can do to get from here to there. So if what you have hope for is something like, I don't know, I want to reverse climate change, gosh, it's hard to figure out how you are going to make that happen, right? So what I encourage people to do is to think globally, but hope locally. Focus on a place where you can make a difference. Maybe it's not, I'm going to reverse climate change. Maybe it's, I'm going to clean up the beach in my neighborhood, right? Or in my county. Maybe it's not that I'm going to reverse political polarization, but maybe I'm going to have a conversation with somebody who's different from me. Focus on where you can have impact because that's where hope comes from.
Okay, that makes really good sense. I grew up in the 70s and right, that was our axiom, right? Think
Mhm.
globally, act locally. So, all right, two quick things then, Jamil, if you don't mind, bear with me. We have a lot of parents of teenagers on with us. What do you do if you have a child who's expressing deep cynicism about the world, saying things like, nothing ever changes, people are selfish? What should a parent say?
I mean, I think that some of the tools from CBT that I offered can help. But more than that, I think that the last thing we want to do is meet cynicism with cynicism, right? We never want to, in my opinion, judge people, least of all our own children, for the feelings that they have or the beliefs that they have. I think that much better than cynicism is curiosity, right? What happened that made you feel that way? What's on your mind? Tell me where this came from, and then maybe gently challenging. In CBT, there's this idea of Socratic collaboration, right? Instead of giving a kid answers and saying, no, you're wrong, people actually are great, that's not probably going to help very much. You can say, well, have there been any times that you've seen somebody act in a kind way? What about this person who I know you really love? What about this person? And you told me this story about this amazing event you went to last week. What were people like there? Some. I think that oftentimes instead of answers, we can give our kids, especially our teenage kids, questions. And I think that those can be a gentler, more open way to guide them towards, again, not naive optimism, but towards a little bit of hope.
Thank you. That's really beautiful, everybody. I love that. So, Dr. Zaki, we have come to the end of our hour together. It has been amazing. But there is one question that we like to ask at the end of every event, and I've never met anybody I want to ask this more to than you. So here we go. After everything that you have studied and experienced and written about, what gives you hope?
Oh, well, I mean, I think my children, first of all, and not just my children, also their generation and younger generations. I feel as though the young people in America and beyond have been so unfairly stereotyped as selfish, egotistical, narcissistic, I interact with young people every day, and I find that those stereotypes couldn't be further from the truth. I find younger generations to be the most globally engaged, the most intent on creating a better world, and the most concerned with other people that I've ever experienced. I mean, certainly than, than my generation. And so I find hope in them.
That's really beautiful. I think that we would all agree that. And it's our young people and the kids. This is why we do it. You know, we work for parents, but we do it because we love kids and students and children. So, Dr. Jamil Zaki, thank you. And your new book, Hope for Cynics. Parents, pick this up. It's an extraordinary read, a lot of great storytelling. So, Jamil, thank you so much for your time tonight. And thank you, everybody. We hope to see you again soon. Stay on for 10 seconds and answer that survey. Thank you, Jamil. Thank
Thanks,
you.
Charlene. Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Okay. Good night.